Hello, Zoom people. Just wanna double check. Are we're good?
Yeah,
Okay.
perfect.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last class of our first module. No, not the whole thing. We still have 1 to 1.5 years ahead of us of this. But this is the last class of our first module. We're wrapping it up. And as with all kinds of finales, let's do something different. Today I have Brian with me. Brian is like one of our five members. So Brian will be talking today. So I'll just introduce Brian a bit. Before that, I just want to thank you all for tuning in with us for like what has it been like 7 to 9 weeks already at this point. I know this is a very unholy time for everyone back home in Indonesia. So thank you so much. I hope you stay tuned in for our remaining modules. And yeah, let me introduce Brian. So Brian is Brian is kind of like our academic daddy because Brian, out of all of us, Brian is the only one who's actually doing a PhD. He's doing a PhD at Princeton in intellectual history, specifically Indonesian intellectual history. His master's dissertation was on Indonesian historians, specifically Ong Hok Ham and Sartono Kartodirjo. And Brian essentially argues that they were sort of like Ong and Sartono were in this weird place where they went to Yale. They were taught American historiography, but they also were Indonesians, and they sort of like had the sense that like this is kind of objective, but this still isn't telling the full story. I know it deep down as an Indonesian, and what they came up with as a response to this was essentially what we come to call subaltern studies. We cite Ranajit Guha, scholars from India, as the founders of subaltern studies. But Brian essentially argues that Ong and Sartono kind of pioneered that even before there was a subaltern studies. So without any more further ado, Brian is gonna hold our session tonight. Let's give him some encouragement.
Well, thank you, Derek. And thank you everyone for showing up, both here and on Zoom. I'm very touched that all of you took time out of your day to come here and to spend more time at school, which is I I spent the past week really pulling this together. But I want to preface today's talk by saying that I'm not a specialist on Chinese Indonesian history. This isn't the field of research that I'm in. This is not Um, it's also not something that I really specialize in, basically. But I am an intellectual historian, right? So what that means is I look at ideas and I look at people. I look at intellectuals and I look at how they produce ideas, I put them in their context, and I really try to understand what makes them tick, right? So in approaching Chinese Indonesian history today, I'd like to do so using the lens of one of the people whom I've studied, Ong Kok. This historian, this man fascinates me to no end. He, I came across him as an undergraduate. When I was trying to pull together an essay on Indonesian historiography, and I've never been able to get him out of my mind since. And I hope through this class, through this talk, I'll be able to show you why he had such an effect on me. Okay? But there's also something else I want to do, and that is to use Ong's life as a window into a broader story. And that broader story is the story of Chinese Indonesians in Indonesia from independence, which is where Derek left us really last week, all the way to about 1998, right? So I want to foreground the story, but I want to pull it down to earth using the life of Ong Kok Kam. Now, I think there are a couple of benefits to this approach. As Pankaj Mishra wrote in his From the Ruins of Empire, history converges in the lines of history, converge in individual lives, right? This really makes history come alive. But on the other hand, there's only so much that a biographical approach can do, right? This is not a social history. This is not a broad political history. It's a very personal history. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind. And there are benefits to this approach, but there are a few pitfalls. But with that said, let's talk about our protagonist, Ong Hok Ham. Ong was born in 1933 in a town in East Java in Indonesia called Surabaya. But what's interesting about him is he grew up speaking Dutch. He grew up in a Sino-Dutch family of a kind that doesn't really exist anymore in Indonesia. And he went to the HBS, the Hogere Burgerschool, right? A school meant for children of priai, of Indonesian aristocrats, and of children of, high-ranking officials. Ong's family was very, very rich, right? He was born to a family of sugar magnates, and so his family afforded to send him to this very prestigious and school of high pedigree. And hearkening back to what Derek told us a few weeks ago, Ong was part of a class of Indonesians who dreamed in Dutch till the end. So he was really in between worlds. But this wasn't the only way that he was in between worlds. Ong was Chinese Indonesian, right? He was gay, and he didn't believe in God. This is a trifecta, really, of taboos in Indonesia. And as Derek told you in the WhatsApp message that he blasted to the group, if all the taboos of Indonesian history decided to come together in one person, it would be Ong Kok Kang, right? In 1957, Ong made his way to Depok, a small town outside Jakarta, to study law in the University of Indonesia. But quickly he left. He read about another historian, Sartono Kartodirjo, who was the first to graduate, the first ever Indonesian to graduate with a history degree from the University of Indonesia. And he thought, they teach history here. Let me study that too. So he left law, he did history, and there's a brilliant passage in his biography by David Reeve, which says that his family was deeply disappointed. His family was disappointed because they weren't sure that he would be able to make money, right? So he did that, and in 1960, what really made his history career take off is that he assisted a scholar called Bill Skinner, G. William Skinner, in studying the history of Chinese assimilation in Indonesia, right? Bill Skinner was a renowned anthropologist / historian who was based in, forgot where he was based, but he did a lot of work on the assimilations of Thai Chinese into Thai society, right? And he wanted to sort of broaden the scope to include Indonesia. And so he had to enlist the help of a few research assistants, Ong included. Another research assistant was Nelly Tan, Indonesia's first Chinese Indonesian sociologist, right? So it was a very star-studded group of research assistants. And we'll come back to this later, right? When we get to the more analytical bits of this talk, so keep that in mind. Keep Ong's research assistantship in mind. In 1968, Ong left for Yale, for New Haven, right? After the turmoil of the events of 1965 in Indonesia, which I'll get to again later, Ong left to study for a PhD in history under Harry Benda, right? Harry Benda was the same person who trained James C. Scott, the person who wrote Weapons of the Weak and a series of anarchy, really, in Southeast Asia. So Ong studied under under Harry Benda, and he graduated in 1975, came back to Indonesia, initially to teach at UI, the University of Indonesia, his alma mater, which he left later to become a public intellectual. Ong never became a full professor. Instead, he spent most of his time writing opinion pieces for two progressive Indonesian newspapers, right? Prisma and Tempo. Right? These newspapers were so outspoken against the Suharto dictatorship that they were closed. Right? They were closed down at the height of the Suharto dictatorship in about the 1980s. So Ong wrote for these outlets. And it's very interesting because when I was doing work on Ong, a lot of the anecdotes that I would get from his former students was that he was a very eccentric teacher. So one of his students in an obituary for Ong wrote that when Ong came back from New Haven, he came back with two things. The first was a history degree, and the second was an ability to cook. And Ong was prouder of his ability to cook. So he would come to class carrying vegetables that he would buy in the wet market and plop them on the table. He would plop those vegetables on the table and let them sit while he taught his students. He would call on students, and if they couldn't answer his questions, he would take the eraser from the whiteboard and toss it at them. He was an eccentric, crazy guy, but he was also extremely sharp. Extremely sharp. His dinner parties at his house would attract. It was a modern version of a French salon, really, right? Politicians, diplomats, academics, writers, actors, they would all congregate in Ong's house in Jakarta, and they would talk about ideas. Ong was always surrounded by books, right? And his study in his house, which is very architecturally remarkable, really. It was a fusion of Javanese and Balinese styles into it. It's magnificent. And if any of you ever go to Jakarta, I'd say skip all the other stuff. Go to Ong's house because it's absolutely amazing. And the note that I want to end on here in this sort of introductory sketch is that Ong became one of Indonesia's first professional historians. So that's what really piqued my interest in him at first, right? Because he was alongside Sartono Kartodirjo and Taufik Abdullah, right? The first generation of Indonesians who got a PhD in history and decided to teach history for a living. Right? So that's important to keep in mind. But now I want to toggle out a bit. Right? And I want to talk about the context in which Ong grew up. By the way, just a bit of housekeeping. So what I plan to do in this talk is to toggle between two things. The first thing is Ong's life, and the second is the broader context which Ong's life sort of illuminates, right? And I'll do that in three main parts. The first part of this is I want to look at what Ong's life tells us about Chinese Indonesian lives post-independence. Indonesia became independent in 1945. It was officially recognized in 1949. So I want to focus on that period, really. So what did the lives of Chinese Indonesians look like in that period? The second is the period surrounding 1965, which was when a failed coup happened in Indonesia, and Chinese Indonesians faced, a tightening noose of discriminative regulations, forced handling. The third thing is what Ong's life tells us about nation building more broadly. And that's where I'll link Ong to the previous sessions, right, which Derek has very elegantly walked us through. So, what does Ong tell us about Chinese Indonesian lives post-independence? This is a quote by Charles Koppel, right, one of the most prominent historians of Chinese Indonesians. And he says, in the formative years of Indonesian nationalism, so 45 to 40, 40 to 49, say, the word bangsa, or race, right, came to be used to denote the concept of nation. Most Indonesian nationalists thought of the nation as comprising the members of the various indigenous Indonesian ethnic groups, right? The Javanese, the Bugis, the Minangkabau, right? But ethnic Chinese, who with a few exceptions were classified as foreign Orientals, or in Dutch, the Vreemde Oosterlingen, right, were perceived by Indonesians as a separate bangsa, or as an entity outside the nation, right? They were the Bangsa Tionghoa. They were not part of Indonesian nationalism. So the sentence that comes after this in Koppel's book is that Chinese Indonesians were not allowed into Indonesian political parties, right, during this period. They just couldn't get membership because they're seen as separate. And the reason why, right, there was such anxiety around the position of Chinese Indonesians is because their loyalty was questioned, right? And the main reason for this is because of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. So with the rise of Chinese nationalism and of Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang, a lot of Chinese Indonesians started showing affinities for their motherland, right? There was a school founded in 1907 called the Tionghoa Huekwan, right? And it was originally sort of founded to promote Confucian values, but eventually morphed into a body that really serves the interests of Chinese nationalism. Right? So that was the fear, that the Chinese in Indonesia had a dual loyalty, or actually not even a dual loyalty, a loyalty to China instead of to the newly formed Indonesian nation. And there was growing pressure for WNI Chinese. WNI stands for Warga Negara Indonesia, Indonesian citizen. Right? So there was growing pressure on Indonesian Chinese to desegregate. Right? There was this idea that Indonesian Chinese lived in separate gated communities. They did not, share the same markets as Indonesians. They didn't go to the same schools. They didn't work in the same places. Right? They were segregated, and there was a push for them to sort of blend in. And there was mounting anti-Semitism as well. I think the culmination of this anti-Chinese furor was the Asatist movement. Right? It was a movement started by a businessman called Asat, who really argued that it was Dutch policy, right, that made Chinese Indonesians more well off than native Indonesians. And what Indonesians had to do was to put forward a sort of affirmative action plan. So Chinese Indonesians were not allowed, according to us, in Asat's way, to trade in rural areas. They had to acquire permits to trade, and that he thought would sort of level the playing field, right? But it was couched in a very discriminatory, very fear-mongering language. And so that really was the hallmark of anti-Semitism in Indonesia during this period. And so what I really want to underline with all this is the fact that the question of what to do with the Chinese minority in Indonesia gained new urgency during this period. And this was the period during which Ong grew up, right? He was born in 1933, so he would have been a young teenager during this period. And so this was the broader atmosphere in which he became an adult. And what I want to do now is I want to introduce to you a debate that was going on about what to do with Chinese Indonesians. So there was a big question, right, which is, what do we do with the Chinese minority whose loyalties we can't really pin down, right? And there were different answers as to what to do. And those answers, those groups of answers really boiled down to two camps, the integrationist camp and the assimilationist camp. So what did the integrationists want to do? They said, and this is from the same book that I quoted just now, WNI Chinese, Indonesian Chinese, should be treated in the same way as other ethnic groups in Indonesia, right? They should just become one of the many groups that are already there. Any demand that they should abandon their cultural distinctiveness was regarded by them as discriminatory and unacceptable. So what they were saying was the Chinese didn't have to do anything to become part of Indonesia. You should just accept them as they are. Right? They shouldn't change their names. They shouldn't intermarry. You don't have to force them to do that. You should just accept them as they are and add them as another of the many groups that make up Indonesia anyway, right? And this way of thinking found its institutional expression through Baperki. Baperki stands for Badan Permusyawaratan Kewarganegaraan Indonesia, a deliberative body for Indonesian citizenship, right? But what's interesting to note about Baperki is that although at first their arguments centered on education, right? We should educate Indonesians to accept Chinese Indonesians as a separate but distinct minority. Eventually, their argument shifted leftwards. Eventually, their leader and so their leadership really argued that the only way to integrate Chinese Indonesians into society was to complete the socialist revolution. That is the only way in which we can transcend these sort of made up boundaries, right? It is by the acquiring of class consciousness that we will finally transcend these petty, disputes about who's a minority and who's not. If you're all working class, then why does it all matter? Right? It really doesn't matter. Not surprisingly, they were disbanded in 1965. So in 1965, I'll foreground this and I'll come back to it later. For those of you who are new to Indonesian history, 1965 was when we saw a coup attempt, right, on Sukarno, Indonesia's first president. It's still unclear what happened. I won't get into the details here. But what's important to note is that after 65, Suharto, the founder of Indonesia's new order, a 32-year-long dictatorship from 66 to 1998, blamed the communists for the coup. He said that it was the communists who fomented the coup. And it was them really who were behind the murder of 6 generals. Right? So in that sort of mess, Baperki was disbanded, unsurprisingly. But let's look at the other side of the thing, and that is the assimilationist side. This group was much more loose. Right? They were a loose coalition of Indonesian intellectuals, but what really glued them together was a newspaper called Star Weekly. Star Weekly was the main newspaper that circulated among the Peranakan in Indonesia. The Peranakan is just a term to denote Chinese Indonesians who have lived in Indonesia for generations. Okay? So they're not new, fresh off the boat Chinese Indonesians. They've lived there for a long time. Most of them speak Indonesian. They've intermarried, and they're more closely aligned to, say, Javanese culture or Minang culture, right, than they are to Chinese culture. So this was their mouthpiece, really, Star Weekly. So what did the assimilationists think? They thought, unlike the integrationists, that the only way to solve the minority problem in Indonesia was for Chinese Indonesians to blend in. They should discard their Chinese culture, change their names, desegregate, and become Indonesian, whatever that meant. Right? Become Indonesian. And how you'd accelerate this was by intermarrying, by abandoning Chinese names, and by sending Chinese Indonesians to national schools. So it is really the assimilationists who sanctioned the government to close down Chinese schools, like the Tianghua Huikwan just now, and for them to take the same classes, have the same curriculum as local Indonesians. And this is where the story gets a bit personal, because my grandmother was a Chinese Indonesian, and she had to stop school because of the government push to sort of close down Chinese schools and move Chinese Indonesians to national schools. But because of the messy bureaucracy that really characterized that period, she never continued school. So that policy had, so she was collateral damage almost, right? If the main institutional sort of backing of the Baperki was the PKI, or the Indonesian Communist Party, the main backing for the assimilationists was the army, but then who also had very similar assimilationist tendencies, right? And this will become important as we move on to the 65 period later. But some of you might be asking, right, what does all this have to do with Ong? Right? How do we toggle back from the broader context to Ong's life? The answer is that Ong was an assimilationist. Ong started his career writing for Star Weekly. And remember that research assistantship that we talked about in the beginning? A lot of the work that he did in that job was sort of channeled through Star Weekly. So this is from one of his articles. I'm not sure how familiar most of you are with Indonesian historiography in general, but there's only one big book on Indonesian political thinking. And it was compiled by a scholar called Herb Faith. Right? It's a long list of sort of political ideas. And Ong Hokam features once. And the essay that was featured from Ong is this essay, his essay in support of assimilation. So I've quoted from his essay here, and I think it's worth reading it in full. Progress toward unity, Ong writes, can only be achieved by means of assimilation, so that the exclusiveness of the minority is destroyed and the relations between minority and majority are improved. It is the sort of assimilation which accords with with the ideals of the Indonesian nation, which rejects groupism and sukuism or tribalism, right? Van Mook, the Dutch Governor General Van Mook's policy emphasized regional and ethnic differences among Indonesians and accentuated the difference between groups of foreign descent and the rest of society. Proceeding towards assimilation means participating in the destruction of the policy of Van Mook. I reflected on this paragraph for a bit, and I think we should, for the purposes of this talk, draw three main points. The first is that it's very clear where Ong's influences lie. He was influenced by the work of his mentor, Bill Skinner, who found out that the Chinese in Thailand could assimilate very, very well into Thai society. So much so that you couldn't tell who was a Thai and who was a Chinese. Right? You can't tell anymore. And Skinner thought that the same could be said about Indonesia. So Ong's mentor really shaped his thinking here. Right? So here we see Ong's academic project bleed into his political project. But second, we also see the seeds of Ong's future projects that would historicize the position of Chinese in the Indies. Remember what he said about Van Mook and Van Mook's policy? That, I think, is a statement that only a historian could make. It is a statement that could only be made if someone is really steeped in Dutch colonial sources and tries to historicize, right, the position of Chinese Indonesians all the way back to when the Dutch were in charge. Right? And once again, we'll come back to this later. But more broadly, and most importantly, for the purposes of this talk, we see an early example of Ong's commitment to nation building. It's clear that Ong cares about what it means to belong to Indonesia, right? And he's really trying to define the boundaries of what counts as Indonesian. Yes.
You know, the Chinese in Thailand shares the same like historical like Chinese Indonesia. Like, do they have like the oppression throughout the colonization?
Well, I'm not an expert on this, but clearly, I mean, the biggest difference is that the Chinese in Siam were not subject to direct colonization.
Oh,
Siam was, yeah.
there's a Western colonization. There was Trump.
So you could argue about the usefulness as a parallel of the Thai to Indonesian parallel here, right? We can pick at that a little bit more, and we can raise this in the Q&A if anyone has more to say. But actually, this is a good time to take a break. Does anyone have questions before I move on? This is the last slide of the first section. I'm moving on to the second. Any pressing questions? Any clarifications? Yes. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
But then like I noticed that like there were a lot after, and so I was wondering why exactly there was.
I guess I'm just curious about like why maybe like socialism like is not like, or like what exactly is like, yeah, I'm just curious, like could you expand more on that and like why it might be like not the answer?
Okay. I think we could go on all day, but the main reason why it didn't work was because of growing anti-socialist hostility in Indonesia from 1950 to 1960. Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia, really tried to carve out a space for socialists and the more leftist factions in Indonesian politics under his broad house banner of Indonesian politics, Nasakom, right? Nationalism, religion, and communism. And this drew a lot of pushback from the army, especially. Right? So it was a very hostile institutional and political culture. That sort of, very bold and almost utopian idea was bound not to succeed, especially with the assimilationists being backed by the army. Once again, I'm not an expert on this, but roughly that's I think.
About like what they were actually, like what they were doing, but also the response.
Yeah. Yeah. So they just went bulldozing on. I mean, but they didn't receive very good feedback. So, yes.
Was there a spectrum of how much of an assimilationist you were? Like, was Ong super, if you're Chinese, you have to fully abandon all of your Chinese culture and fully assimilate to become
That's a
Indonesian?
great question.
Or is it like, oh, you can abandon 80% of it and
Okay, that's a great question. And there was a sort of sliding scale of assimilationism, but the key factor was coercion versus guidance. So some people thought you should coerce the Chinese Indonesians to dropping their Chineseness. Other people thought you should guide them. Ong thought you should guide them. So that's sort of, I mean, that's a very broad stroke answer, but roughly that's the scale. Asya?
Like it's on top of that question, because I was wondering
In terms of, that's always hard to look at history from the peasant lands and whatnot, right? But I was just wondering in terms of people, just actual real life living people, like what do they think about this? Because you would assume, because the assimilationists are backed by the, like it started in Star Weekly, it started from a newspaper, the mouthpiece of the Peranakan, right? While the integrationist is more of a more institutionalized baperki type of thing. So just based on that, I would assume that the Peranakan is more of an assimilationist.
Because they're already assimilated. Right. And that's the thing. So they were a very fertile ground for this ideology, for this sort of way of thinking, because they're already assimilated, right? They've been here for generations and they speak Javanese and they send their kids to study wayang golek. So it's really so for them it was just an extension of what they were already doing. Right? But that's a great question. Yeah, totally. I'd love to take more questions, but we have a bit of ground to cover, so we'll come back to this in Q&A. What time is it? 30. Okay. The next step really is to talk about Ong and what his life tells us about 1965 and the events that followed. Right? So I told you that in 1965 we saw a coup. It's unclear who instigated it, but what we know is that 6 generals were murdered and the communists were blamed for this. And it is on the back of all these events that Suharto came to power and really put in place the new order, a dictatorship that lasted for 32 years. In a nutshell, that's 65 and the stakes of what we're talking about, right? It's so unclear whether the violence towards Chinese Indonesians that followed the events of 65 were racially or ideologically motivated, right? Some scholars argue that it was overt racism that drove Indonesians, native Indonesians, to make the lives of Chinese Indonesians very difficult, either by damaging their property or by hurting them physically. Right? But other people, and this is the broad consensus really, when Charles Koppel thinks this, Matthias Fibiger in his Suharto's Cold War, a new book that I recommend that you read if you're interested in this period. Mm-hmm. Suharto's Cold War, right? There's a short section on the violence of 65. The consensus is that the violence perpetrated towards Chinese Indonesians was not aimed at them because they were Chinese, but rather because they were suspected of being close to the Communist Party. Right? It's this logical jump that if you're Chinese, then you're most likely, a fan of what's happening in China. And China, people thought, backed the Indonesian Communist Party. So it's because of that. It's because of these ideological connotations that the Chinese suffered the brunt of violence in 60. But regardless of this debate, what we do know is that the Chinese in Indonesia faced what Koppel calls a tightening noose of regulations that were discriminatory. Their newspapers were closed. The public celebration of Chinese New Year in Indonesia was banned. Right? Display of Chinese characters in public was banned as well. And the import of Chinese novels, magazines, music was put in the same category as the importation of narcotics and contraband and guns, basically. And the apotheosis of all this, the culmination of all this, was the forming of the Badan Koordinasi Masalah Cina, or the coordination body for the Chinese problem, by Suharto in about 1967. And the policy that this body really pushed was a broad and coercive regime of name change. So Chinese Indonesians were forced to change their names. And so what I really think we can explore here, and this is an avenue of research that I think is very productive, is to look at why the government, the Suharto government, was so obsessed with language. Why is it that they wanted to stop Chinese characters from being displayed in the public sphere? And why is it that they forced Chinese to change their names? Right? What was it about language that was so politically sensitive? Could it be? I mean, there was a PhD thesis written by a Cornell linguistics student who argued that the reason that speaking Chinese in Indonesia indexes Chinese identity. If you speak Mandarin, it sort of signifies that you ally yourself with China instead of with Indonesia. It's such a crucial part of Chinese identity, right? That it was seen as a threat by the New Order government, who wanted to institute an Indonesian language project, right? A project of nation building and forced unity by the imposition of the Indonesian language over indigenous languages and, of course, foreign languages. So this is a live debate. I'd love to see more work on this, for sure. The work by the linguist Joseph Arrington might be interesting, but there's not much else. Yes?
Yeah. Do you know whether there were more Chinese in Indonesia or Mandarin Chinese?
That's a good question. So what we know is that most migration to the southern seas came from Guangdong and Fujian, right, in the south of China. So most of them spoke Cantonese. Yes. And Hokkien, sorry. Cantonese and Hokkien dialect. So,
Oh,
I don't know.
yeah.
Fujian. Yes.
But they changed.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll pick this up in Q&A if that's okay. So where was Ong during the turmoil of 65? Here we have to introduce another character, Nugroho Noto Susanto. Nugroho was what historians call the court historian of Suharto's New Order. Whatever Suharto wanted Nugroho to write, Nugroho would write. Nugroho headed a body called the Armed Forces History Center, right? The military history center of Indonesia in the 1960s. And they were famous for publishing a version of the events of 65 that was highly sympathetic to what Suharto wanted those events to look like, right? But Nugroho was a very complex character. Alongside Ong and Sartono and Taufik Abdullah, he was part of the first generation of professional Indonesian historians. And he was Ong's classmate back in the University of Indonesia. Right? Ong took a long time to graduate, so by the time when 65 rolled around, Nugroho was already part of this institutional history structure, and Ong was still finding his feet a little bit. So Ong was part of a team assembled by Nugroho to scour Communist Party archives and find evidence for their guilt. Right? His job was to read the Harian Rakyat, the newspaper of the Indonesian Communist Party, to read correspondence between party members, to try and figure out, to mine evidence for the Communist Party's guilt. But this sent Ong into a spiral. David Reeve, Ong's biographer, says, Ong found no evidence of conspiracy, adding that another thing which was depressing and which was quite significant intellectually on Ong, was to read these letters, these little people writing intelligent things about class. I was so impressed with them, Ong says. And so this really sent Ong into a period of mental turbulence. In the year following 65, Ong would go out into the streets, shouting at people about how his research was being misused by the government. And he shouted, "Long live the Communist Party! Long live the Communist Party!" Not surprisingly, he was jailed in 1966. He was thrown in jail for a 6-month-long period. And he got out because of Nugroho's word to the government that Ong would behave. So Nugroho gave his personal guarantee that Ong was not a communist, was not a communist sympathizer. He was just very troubled by Nugroho. It is also during this period that Ong started seeing a psychiatrist. One of Indonesia's first psychiatrists, Dr. Kusumanto Setyanogoro, who was introduced to Ong by his friend, Sujatmoko, another prominent Indonesian intellectual. And this is one of the most haunting passages that I came across from Ong. So in 1967, on Dr. Kusumanto's urging, Ong was asked to write a report on his mental state, to write a report on what he was going through mentally. And this is it's worth reading this out in full, because it's a fascinating passage. One would think that I should be unnoticed in this atmosphere of rebuilding Indonesia and be considered an outsider to politics or to the molders of society and things. I must confess that I have simply no conceptions for society and all those things, though I might have certain values, but as a single scholar, one has really no tools to try to impose those values. And in general, I'm more fascinated by the course of things than by my own ideas for the good of society. I don't know about you, but this reads like the words of a dejected and broken man. It reads like the words of a man who has been broken by his times and who is pessimistic about where Indonesian politics would go. Also, these seem like the words of a man who has given up. And over the next few years, it would seem like Ong did give up. In 1968, just 1 year later, Ong left to Yale in his words, right, in a letter to Benedict Anderson, to take his mind off politics. His friends cobbled together scholarship money for him to be able to survive his first 2 months in New Haven. Benedict Anderson chipped in, Herb Faith chipped in, right? Indonesian intellectuals, Indonesianists in Australia and America cobbled together the limited money they had in their savings to fly Ong all the way to America to start his PhD. Now, when I wrote my dissertation, this was really the focus this is really what I focused on, right? What Ong wrote during his period in Yale was a social and economic history of Dutch colonialism in a town called Madiun in East Java. Right? It was a brilliant social history that foregrounded peasant experience, and this work is what I argued really made Ong a forerunner to subaltern studies, right? Which started only in the 1980s, the mid-1980s. But all that for next time, right? Ong graduated in 1975, and he came back to Indonesia feeling like he'd earned the right to speak for himself, right? In the same letter in another letter to Benedict Anderson, Ong wrote that he still didn't know what was Indonesian, what was Chinese. He still had these turbulent thoughts about identity in his mind, but he started to feel like he gained the authority to speak on matters, right, that pertain to society. These were his exact words. He was unsure about his future, the future of Indonesia, what was Indonesia and what was Chinese, but found that he was more confident and could be more straightforward and blunter, right? Upon his return to Indonesia, he turned down a job. When he graduated, he turned down a job from ISEAS, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. And he went back to the University of Indonesia to become a lecturer there, right? And this is where we move to the third section, the third and final section of today's talk, right? Because I argue that it is during this period that we see Ong's ideas about nation building really crystallize. But this was the crux of Ong's nation building project. So according to Anthony Reid, a very prominent historian of Indonesia, he said that nation building for Ong meant creating space for minorities and their own separate traditions within the dangerously uniform nationalist project. But this was in an obituary for Ong, and Reid doesn't really flesh out what this means. What I think it means is that in his work, in his later work, right after graduation, it was really Ong's desire, Ong's commitment to broaden what it meant to be Indonesian. In 1988, Ong left his teaching position to write full-time for Prisma and Tempo, the progressive Indonesian newspapers that I mentioned earlier. Gunawan Muhammad, the editor and founder of Tempo, once wrote that it was a lot of work to prepare Ong's writings for publication. They were brilliant, but they were very, very difficult. The reason why, Gunawan Muhammad says, is because whereas other writers gave him articles that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, Ong's article were all middle. Right? They were lost in the minutiae of historical events, but they were brilliant. So Gunawan Muhammad persisted with Ong. Right? These articles that Ong wrote for Tempo and Prisma, Kompas as well, Indonesia's main newspaper, were very subversive. Right? He would write articles that criticized the new order obliquely, as Sydney pointed out in the group, right? That would criticize the new order very obliquely, using Majapahit or ancient Indonesian kingdoms as proxies, right? He would say, all kingdoms that don't have roots will fail. He didn't say that the new order didn't have roots. He just said that all kingdoms that don't have roots will fail. But sometimes he was more overt. And when it came to Chinese Indonesians, he was very overt. He wrote two very sharp articles about Chinese Indonesians. The first was Citra Minoritas Pedagang sebagai Setan, or the image of a trading minority as demons, and a history of sejarah anti-Cina, or a history of anti-Sinicism. To put it in a nutshell, what Ong tried to argue in these articles was that, I might actually show you a quote. Ong argued in these articles, right, that the Chinese of Indonesia had been well integrated into Indonesian societies until the Dutch rudely forced them apart. Dutch economic, educational, and legal policy, he wrote, had deliberately worked to rupture the close links between the Chinese of Indonesia and the Indonesians themselves. So whereas some people saw the very presence of Chinese in Indonesia as a colonial legacy that could be undone, Ong argued that it was the gulf between the two groups that should be undone, right? This is what I mean by Ong historicizing the position of Chinese Indonesians in Indonesian society. Right? He really drew from history to say that they aren't, that their separateness, right, the separateness of Chinese Indonesians from mainstream society was a colonial product. It was the Dutch that divided Indonesians into a tripartite structure of Europeans, foreign Orientals, and native Indonesians, or Bumiputra, right? It was the Dutch who did that. And this is a colonial legacy that we should overturn, really. He was very forceful in his argument for the inclusion of Chinese into a broad idea of what it meant to be Indonesian. And this is the final slide, by the way. So thank you for sticking with me for this time. I think what I want the main takeaway from today's session to be is that if you think back to what Derek told you about the imagined community, right? And how Indonesia, according to Ben Anderson, was essentially a fictive community, right? We start to understand what Ong was trying to do. Right? Ong was trying to write Chinese Indonesians into the imagined community. He was using history, public history, to renegotiate the boundaries of what it meant to belong to an Indonesian community. The nation is a fiction, and Ong was trying to write a community into that fiction. That was the power of Ong's project. And this leaves me with a parting thought. This is a letter that Ong sent to Ben Anderson before he embarked on his sort of public intellectual journey in New Order Indonesia. He wrote, "Sometimes I wonder what I'm doing here. Well, the answer is that as an Indonesian and a historian, one cannot go away. One should at least believe in the future, if not the present. Perhaps with a bit of desperation, I cling to the straw of the future." I think this was one of the quotes that really made me enamored with Ong, I think. And it speaks to me, it speaks to, I'm sure, many other Indonesian historians who persist in writing histories despite turbulent times. And I chose this quote to end this section of deconstructing Indonesia because I also think it captures the spirit at the heart of our project. What is our project? It is an almost naive, overly optimistic belief that history can do something, right? That history matters. And that even when it doesn't seem like it, we shouldn't stop trying. So with that, I thank all of you for listening, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you. Okay, before we move on to Q&A, can I invite Nathan to speak a bit about Module 2 and to sort of give a short introduction, maybe, if that's okay with you? Because we're going to transition to the second part of deconstructing Indonesia, and I think it's good to get a bit of a sense of what we're going to do. Is that okay?
So, hi everyone. I think I'll just share like our website a bit. How do you?
It's a mouse. It's the tracker. I'm losing track of the tracker. All right. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
There it is. Oh. That's a little bit messy.
Very good. Bisa sini.
Oh, you want to share to your laptop? Let me try to figure this out.
Just stop share.
Oh, the problem is Microsoft Edge. Let me see if Chrome is better. There we go. It's okay. I can just do it. Oh, you wanna? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, if you look into our websites, today is the last day of the first module, and the next one will focus more on the indigenous tradition and philosophies. So we will do the decolonizing period of deconstructing Indonesia. So we'll have like a couple of guests from Gegerianto. He's an anthropologist, graduated from Heidelberg, if I'm not mistaken, in Germany. And he's now teaching at UI, University of Indonesia, that Brian has mentioned before. But we will talk a lot more into the syncretic beliefs. For example, in Sumba, there's they are in search for identity that really connects their indigenous beliefs, kepercayaan adat, and like the new coming beliefs or traditions or culture.
and we'll explore on more into indigenous epistemologies. So it will start probably in the next 2-3 weeks. So we will rest a bit. We will travel, and we'll be back at the same place at Columbia. So if you are here around New York, please come because we only have 10 people here, 15 maximum, 25 in the first class. So yeah, back to Brian.
How are we going to do this? Just a quick Q&A. Do we have people from Zoom who want to?
How we do it is Zoom the mic uses laptop as a mic for people in person, and then we can alternate between Zoom. So like Zoom usually use this as a speaker.
Okay.
So like you pick out someone who wants to speak. If anyone raises their hand or if like there's anything anyone wants to say, we'll put them on speaker here.
Okay.
Or you could even just read out the chats.
Okay.
Sometimes people like ask questions and like post comments on the chat.
Okay. Got it.
That's really how we do it.
Okay.
What's happening now?
Just a Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just give the mic to you.
Okay, I have a quick question about like what's the position of Indonesia during Cold War? Like,
That's
it's
a great
really
question.
I'm really curious about that. Yeah.
Okay. It's a very good question. Early on, Sukarno, Indonesia's first president, really pushed for an axis that would encompass all newly decolonized nations who did not want to pick between two sides, right? And that sort of led to the Bandung Conference in '55, the Asian African Conference, which was attended by Chou Enlai and Gamal Nasser, Nehru, right? So this was the non-aligned axis that would later evolve into the non-aligned movement with their movements and with their meetings in Belgrade and the new emerging forces organization. It's this really complicated and grand history, but this wasn't always the case, right? So formally, Indonesia's position was bebas dan aktif, or free and independent, right, during the Cold War. But in practice, this didn't always turn out to be the case. Under Sukarno, Indonesia was arguably closer to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union funded the building of Indonesia's biggest stadium, Gelora Bung Karno, right, which seated like 88,000 people. And at some point, Sukarno also told the Americans to go to hell with their aid, right? Because he was afraid that they had sinister motives to inject aid into the country. But under Suharto, right, after '65, it could be argued that Indonesia was closer to the Western Bloc. But it's a very complicated history, but that's it in a nutshell. I hope that sort of helps. Anything else? Nathan first, and that's it.
Oh, you go first. Okay. So I have a question. If you are in Ong Hokam's position during that period of time, and you should choose whether you want like Chinese Indonesian to be in the integrationist part or the assimilationist part, what will you choose, and what's a bit of your reasoning?
That's a very difficult question. That's a very, very difficult question. Yeah, you know what? Maybe.
No, because you know like the historical context, you know like the struggles. So I'm just curious if you are in that position and now in this era.
Okay, my very honest and slightly cowardly answer is I don't know. I don't know. I can approach this period as a historian, but I think it's beyond my remit to pick a side.
Okay.
Yes.
Two questions in that, I guess during that time, were there, oh God, okay. Were there like collaborations between the integrationists and assimilationists? Like, did they ever work together and what points did they converge in? And then like now, like looking at Indonesian society now, like what is the approach to Chinese Indonesians currently?
Okay. Both very good questions. The answer to the first is not that I know of. There weren't too many. There wasn't too much in a cross-pollination between the two. To answer the second question, once again, I'll put my historian's hat on and tell you that the integrationists lost out after 65, right? Because of their links to the Communist Party, they were disbanded, and it was really the assimilationists who took charge from them. You could argue that Indonesia is still reeling from the after effects of assimilationist policies, the forced closing of Chinese schools, for instance, right? And in fact, Indonesians were only once again allowed to celebrate Chinese New Year. Was it when did Gus Dur become president? What year was that?
2004.
2003, yeah. So in the early 2000s, right? So it's very clear that the assimilationists won out in the short term, and we're still trying to negotiate the after effects of that now. But both very good questions. Thank you. Anything else? And maybe something from the online audience?
There's one.
Okay. Yes. One. How do I make?
Oh, hello.
Hi.
So I have a question that based on the history that is widely spread, it sounds like the anti-Chinese is movement is coming from like for political reasons, such as from the colonial, right? The main goals is to achieve either the economic agendas or political agendas, and then it's also happened again during the Sukarno. I mean, sorry, Suharto. But then, is there any pressure from the bottom up people? Let's say like the actual pressure. Uh, is it coming from the government who use the things that actually not happen in our society, or is there any like ethnic bottom up issues that is also happen at the same time?
That's a brilliant question. Thank you for asking it. Again, I have very limited knowledge about because this isn't my field, but I think you're onto something. I think that it would be doing we'd be doing a disservice if we attributed all of the blame to ethnic tensions to structural government policy, right? Surely there were very bottom-up elements of this story, and surely there's work to be done in uncovering that story, right? I think I can tell you, right? I can't give you examples off the top of my head, but I think that's a very productive avenue of research. We'd have to see how, a sort of this story of segregation, which is seemingly imposed from the top down, really comes to life in people's everyday lives, right? How did people negotiate this? I don't know, but I'd love to find out. Yes, thank you. Alcia?
Like on top of that, because I was thinking about the colonial segregation, the grouping that was imposed by colonial times, right? Because I remember thinking that, I don't know if you guys are familiar, there was a few theories about how Islam came to be in Indonesia. You would assume it's from the Arabs, right? But that's not the biggest theory that was supported. Like there was two theories. One is it came from Gujarat, India, and then the second one is actually came from the Chinese merchants from the Silk Road. So, and both of these theories are, I think, there's this professor in UE that's doing research on this, and his evidence is on gravestone markers. and how like the gravestone markers, the Arabic writing that came, like the notes that it came way before 13th century. So if that was the case, I was thinking about how Derek talks about networks and about when we were talking about the VOC, when the Dutch first came and colonized Indonesia, they were utilizing already existing networks of merchants, of traders, of whatnot, because they wanted our spices, right? So I'm just curious to wonder about the history of the Chinese merchants that came before, because it was Ong was, and I agree with Ong about how the Dutch was kind of, there was already a cleavage that they were trying to like make, right? Like divide et impera, it's always like, you know, like if all of the people are fighting, they're not going to fight the real common enemy, which is the colonizers. So I was just wondering if there's any manuscripts or anything that you have found during your like your research about the relations of Chinese before there was the conceptualization of Indonesia as a nation, I guess. Other sultanates or even like Hindu kingdoms, Buddhist kingdoms, so Islamic sultanates. I was thinking about that.
Do you have a time frame in mind?
Probably before Dutch came in when?
1602.
1602. So the 14th century, because if Islam came in 13th century, and I know the Chinese came even before Islam. So I know it's a broad question, but
Yeah, of course. Very good question. I think there were, I think I can sort of foreground two things. The first is the movement of Chinese merchants, right, out of their own accord from China to Indonesia for trade purposes, which happened quite a lot. And I think that's why the thesis that Islam was really brought to Indonesia by Chinese merchants has so much force, because there were Chinese in Indonesia in the early modern period in great number. But I think it's important to color this in with a bit of context, right? The relationship between early Indonesian kingdoms and China was one of vassalage, very, very often, right? So there's Merle Ricklefs, MC Ricklefs, in his History of Modern Indonesia, writes about the ships of Chinese Admiral Cheng He arriving in Samarang, right, in all their glistening yellow glory, right, golden glory. They were so imposing and so intimidating that the rulers of Samarang felt like they had no option but to become their vassals, to give them beautiful sculptures like the bunga mas or the golden flowers, to really appease these forces from overseas, right? And so a lot of the relations between the Chinese and Indonesians happened within the structure of vassalage. Yes, one more.
What's the comment?
According to my knowledge, like ancient Chinese government, like in Ming Dynasty or in Yuan Dynasty, or we don't try to establish a really like strict or stringent like vassal relationships with countries around us. I would just try to do something like try to form a friendly relationships. I don't know the truth. Maybe you are the expert on this, but what we learned, like we're trying just to do the trade and we try to spread our influence instead of like being colonists, try to conquer the foreign land. We were not trying to do that.
It's just the West.
Yeah, just the West. Chinese never do that. Except for Mongolian. Except for Mongolian, but all the Chinese, like authentic Chinese, didn't try to do that. Yeah.
Good. I think that adds a lot of nuance to the discussion. Yes. If we're being more granular, this relationship wasn't a relationship of outright coercion, right? When Chinese admirals landed on Javanese shores, they didn't force Indonesians to pay them fealty or to subordinate them, right? But and there's a lot of literature around this, right? So why did Indonesians decide to bring gifts to these foreigners from overseas? Is it because they just wanted to be in their good graces? Maybe. We don't know. Right. Nathan.
Yeah, there's a question from Professor Margaret Scott. Great take. Ong Hokham and Gus Dur formed the Democracy Forum in the mid-90s to advocate against Suharto. Do you think it was a sideshow or did it play a role in creating oppositions to Suharto?
That's a brilliant question, and one that I wish I could answer. Unfortunately, I'm not as well versed in this sort of modern period of Indonesian history. Um, as to whether it was a sideshow, I don't think so. I think that there was a lot of anxiety, right, generated by Ong's sort of opposition to New Order policy. There's a book that I came across. It was edited by Gunawan Muhammad. It was it was more of a pamphlet than a book, I think. And it included a two-page essay by Ong outlining why he thought it was the worst thing ever that Tempo was closed by the New Order government. He said the title of the piece was New Order Development Eats Its Own Citizens Alive. Right? Pembangunan Orde Baru memakan anak-anaknya. That is very, very, so it was a it was a very it was a very forceful opposition. And I think we have reason to believe that the Suharto regime took this pretty seriously. I think one of the reasons why Ong never became a professor in the University of Indonesia was because the New Order government was very wary of the influence that he would wield, right? So it wasn't completely an agentic personal choice. I think it was also imposed on him from the outside. So that's a great question. I wish I could answer it in more detail.
There's a question on
There,
Zoom.
yeah.
Yes. Oh,
So-
I think your hand has been up for very long. I'm sorry. Yes, Ranga, go ahead.
Hi.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Okay, perfect. First of all, thanks for the insightful presentation. It was lovely to get to know Ong Hokam more because I've only heard of him. I'm an undergrad. I'm still writing several papers on Indonesian history. Ong's name popped up, and during one of my conversations with my professor, who specializes in Indonesian history, I asked him Ong Hokam, and he basically said the same thing that you mentioned earlier on your lecture, which were eccentricism. And he said that his eccentric bohemian bohemian lifestyle and affected his writing. Would you agree with that statement? Because yeah, I'm curious. Yeah.
That's a brilliant question. It did in a few ways. I think the first way it influences writing, and I think this will be our last question to give us some time to rest, if that's okay. Or but we'll see. Okay, we have one. We can gather. But back to Ranga's question, I think it did. Right? Remember what Gunawan Muhammad said about Ong's writings being very, how do we put this, all over the place? I think that stemmed from Ong's refusal to play by the rules of the academy as well. Right? Ong was a very colorful character in that regard. Right? He eschewed academic convention. His books had to be edited. He never wrote another book besides his doctoral thesis, by the way, which was only published after his death. Right? So I think Ong's bohemian lifestyle bled into his writing in the sense that he wasn't a stickler for academic convention, right? But another way in which it might have manifested is in Ong's refusal of theory, right? Ong was not a theoretical writer, and I know that that statement carries a lot of baggage, but this is coming from the man himself. He clearly says that he doesn't care much for theory. He cares about events and about people. He said that the best way to write history was to find someone who seems to be having a tough time, who seems to be confused, and you follow that person. Follow that person through the archives, right? That's how you write history. So that's a great question, Nanda. I hope that answers it somewhat. Okay, maybe one last question from Derek.
Right. So wait. I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you could flesh out the economic position of the Chinese in Indonesian society a bit more and how the legacy of perhaps the Dutch, or maybe of how Dutch colonial rule sort of like influenced that, and maybe compare that to how it was before and after. For two reasons. One, this question came up a lot in like the previous sections, the sort of like ethnic division of labor, but also I think this is what adds salience to Sakira's question about socialism.
Yeah.
Because I think, again, I think sort of if I'm trying to think through the position of the integrationists and sort of how they turned socialist, it was like it has nothing to do with ethnicity. That there's a chasm between the Chinese and the rest of it. It's an economic chasm. And I think that's where the salience comes from. And so I was wondering if you could flesh that out a bit more.
Once again, that's an awesome question. And I think I have to gather my thoughts a little bit here. I don't think that I think you're right. I think that your intuition is right. That a lot of that this chasm that you see between Chinese Indonesians and the rest of Indonesian society can be explained as a class chasm instead of an ethnic chasm, right? And we see this in the Asaatist movement, right? And the language in which they sort of couched their often racist aspirations. They at the core of their gripe with the Chinese minority was economics, right? But for these ideas to gain a wide audience and to gain virulence, they have to be coated in racist language. So I think you are onto something, and I wish I could flesh it out more. I wish I would point you to Charles Koppel's book, Indonesian Chinese in Crisis. There, I think you get a really systematic treatment of this question, especially from the period 1950 to about 67. But I don't think I'm best placed to answer that. But thank you. It's very thought provoking. And thank you, everyone. I think we had a very good discussion. I'm so happy many of you turned out. Thank you for sticking till the end, and I hope to see you in future iterations of this program. Okay. Have a good evening.
Thank you for coming.